It's hard to believe in good because it's hard to find good sometimes. It's easy to believe in evil because it's everywhere. Every human story is a story of good against evil. There is not a story. You just decide what you think is good and what you think is evil, and then you tell your story.
We have this really interesting case study with WNBA and Caitlin Clark, and something that's really inspirational happening and really fresh that's happening in women's basketball. And then you have war happening. And we live inside of a world that both are happening at the same time.
I don't say things to be controversial. I try so hard to be incredibly inclusive and rounded in my conversations. But this cultural trend of medically changing children's gender is, to me, one of the most horrific things I've seen in my lifetime.
Hey guys, you're listening to the Mindshift podcast. I'm Aaron McManus, and I'm here with my dad, Erwin McManus. We have a thing coming up on April 24th called the Arena Summit. It is our live, free, monthly event with our community. So we do this thing called the Arena Live in Los Angeles. It's our conference. We are the next TED. I'm speaking that into existence because we are, and we're going to be even more interesting, and I'm very excited. Last year was our first conference. We sold it out. This year we're doing another conference, more room for more people. It's going to be amazing. But we do these monthly summits where essentially a speaker will come who's just excellence in their field and talks, and then we ask them questions, and then we open up to the community for questions. And I think this is an amazing place to engage with world-class thinkers, founders, creators, businessmen, CEOs, and just amazing people who've created beautiful things, and you get access to them. So join it. It's free. Go to thearenasummit.com/RSVP. Join us April 24th.
We'll see you there.
I got some friends in town. They're the most extroverted humans on the planet.
Now, they're from Sweden?
Sweden, from Stockholm.
I didn't know Swedes were extroverted.
This one is. I told him, I said, you're not Swedish, you're Mexican. You're Mexican or Puerto Rican or something, because you're the most warm, talkative, extroverted Swede I've ever met in my life. It's very funny.
Because my understanding is Swedes have a little bit of a reputation for being a little bit aloof or cold.
Cold? Yeah, that's why I like them.
This one, though. Unexpressive emotionally.
I found the Carlos Pimentel of Sweden. He is straight up
or
Carlos,
Puerto Rican
Swede.
All right.
No, good week. How are you?
Oh, good. Still working my way through recovery.
Yeah, you got back from Costa and your eyes look amazing.
Oh, well, thanks.
Healed up.
So my eyes look good on the outside, but my head's killing me on the inside. I've been having migraine headaches, and which is a great reminder sometimes that what's going on inside of someone is not what's going on outside of them, that things can look good on the outside and still you're struggling through stuff on the inside.
Yeah. Well, story of my life. Story of my life. Okay. What do we have? What do we got? What's going on in the world?
Well, it seems like it's either super intense in the world right now with what's going on in, the Gaza Strip in Israel, Middle East, and then or super culturally, connected to where you have Caitlin Clark and phenomenon of women's college basketball and the WNBA and all the conversations around salaries and equity and all that sort of thing, and so there's a lot going on all around us, and I think
I wouldn't say that's that important. I'm sure it is to WNBA players, but I don't know if it's like culturally the same level as
but it's funny
Iran sending 300 drones to
It is interesting to me
Gaza.
that strikes me is that what comes to my mind right away is the Gaza Strip with Israel and the Palestinian people, and then the WNBA, and completely left my mind the fact that our former president is being indicted for who knows how many different things in a court case right now, and it does strike me as really funny. I saw this poll, I think it was on CNN, where they walked through all the indictments and everything that's going on with Trump, and then they asked all these people, are they going to vote for Biden? And they all said no. And you can hear the journalists going, all right, so you're saying that regardless of all the indictments and everything else, you're still going to vote for Trump. And these were evidently Democrats that they had brought in who were shifting their position. So you have all these different things happening in culture. And sometimes I wonder, how do we pick what's important to us? How do we pick what issue or what, crisis or what dilemma we focus our life on? Because I think most people are just trying to figure out how to pay the bills, how to make it through the week, and how to find meaning in their life. And which is, I think, maybe a great point of conversation is, how do you keep yourself centered? How do you keep yourself focused on what you can do with your life and what you should do with your life when there's so many things going on all around us and so many distractions that can pull us in so many different directions?
I mean, it's very interesting, right? Like you look at you look at what the state that our state is in, and you look at the cities across the West Coast, and it's pretty horrific. It's really bad. And so and we've talked about this for years, of whether it's political or not political. There is just some reality that I don't know if where we live is what it used to be. It's something unique. There's always, I think, people make the place. I think this place is very interesting with the people. But sometimes, roads make places. Sometimes, taxes make places. Sometimes the weather makes places. And I think it's been a unique season of the question, why do I live in LA?
Some of you who listen might know Kim works a lot with refugees, and she helps an immense amount helping people from other countries make a home here in the United States, find a place to live, get an education, get a job. So she's been doing this for quite a long time. So she interviewed 3 different people who came in through Mexico. All 3 of them separately said they were financed, this is what they said, through the George Soros Foundation, through the Catholic Church, to migrate into the United States without documentation.
Interesting.
And your mom doesn't even know who George Soros is. So she's not one of those conspiracy theory people. She's not trying to create some kind of, controversy. She just asked me, have you ever heard of someone named Soros? And I said, yes, honey, I have. She goes, well, 3 of the different refugees that I interviewed said that all of them independently told me they were financed through this guy named George Soros, through the Catholic Church, to come to the United States as an immigrant illegally.
Interesting.
And sometimes, and I'm just throwing out what conversation we just had, but it makes you wonder sometimes how many of us think that, how many of us are completely unaware of the underlying influences and pressure points in the global economy and the global currency. And it starts to make me wonder if the people who are all conspiracy theorists are not maybe right. Because when I get someone like him who doesn't even know about conspiracies telling me this, so I'm actually showing her on the internet, this is who George Soros is, and this is what he does, and this is who he's financed. And she goes, oh, I just thought it was really odd that they all had the same story.
It's really interesting to me. Were they Muslim refugees? Were they
no,
Mexican refugees?
They were not. They were Latin American.
American, okay.
Not from Mexico. I think they're from Guatemala to other countries.
Yeah.
But all of them independently said that they were financed through the Catholic Church, encouraged to immigrate to the United States, and they were financed by George Soros to come to the United States.
That's really interesting and really heavy. And also, if you Google him and look up conspiracy theories around George Soros, there's a lot connected. Really interesting stuff. I think he's connected to funding attorney generals, and I think it's attorney generals and sheriffs in different counties across America, which is very odd. Why would you want to have so much political influence over something that's so unique? But I've had friends of yours that are very intelligent, very powerful people who've pre-COVID have said for a long time that is a very evil man. So without making any moral judgments on his character, who he is, I don't know him, but I do know his money's connected to a lot of really interesting things.
Yeah, all I'm sharing is the story that was passed on to me that actually happened.
Okay.
From someone who has no agenda. And it doesn't have anything really to do with our subject here on Mind Shift, but I just thought that was some interesting bits of information.
Yeah, I think I was very engaged in the political, the political stature of where we were at 4 years ago when we were in the last election. I don't have as much interest in this one because the reality is you don't win friends or win people by stating your political views. Really, it's the thing that's probably the most divisive other than religion, is probably the most divisive subject matter that's out there.
Yeah.
So I keep it to myself. I sometimes rant on it on this podcast. But I was having this conversation with some friends last night. This is a complete detour from what we were initially talking about. Like how do you know what's important to pay attention to?
Well, how do you know what's true?
Yeah, I don't know, and we can't solve that right now. So I have no idea. But I want to talk about maybe growing up a pastor's kid, and we've talked about this in some of your messages, like how I'd grow up with, most kids grow up like Goosebumps. They have camp stories about ghosts and about monsters and about things. But when I grew up, it was a lot of stories about really heavy spiritual situations, whether it's like exorcism or demon possession or, addiction. And these I get nervous talking about it. I get like angsty even thinking about it. But I had some friends over and they were talking about some Swedish artists. And they were talking about this band that's really dark, and they played the song, and I was like, "This is literally just saying different names of the devil in like a super pop.
Wow.
Think like Kiss.
Yeah,
it's like kind of that kind of vibe." And they were like telling me about it, and I'm like, "Well, now I'm gonna have to play like 3 hours of worship music to get this crap out of my house." And they're laughing because one of them's a pastor's kid, and they're both religious. They both believe in something, and they were talking, they're like, well, what's the issue with us being not interested? They're like, we appreciate dark art. And they'd be like really into Rick Owens, and they'd be really into this like dark artist. And he's like an older guy, and he's like so he has like the biggest pop writers in Sweden. And Sweden has some of the biggest pop writers in general, like Max Martin, the Avicii, you have Swedish House Mafia, you have all these like the guy who owns Spotify is Swedish. Like you have just Swedes and music are very synonymous, right? So they're like some of the biggest pop writers write this really dark music for this guy, and he's a massive, and he comes out with like Vikings, remember like the warlock that has like the white face, and like they're kind of like very dark,
right?
That's how he dresses. And I'm like, and I'm listening to this, and I'm going, I don't feel as weird because I know they're not dark people in their like soul, but they also really enjoy dark art. He's an artist, he does dark art. Like, it's really interesting. It's an interesting discussion. And then the other friend is pastor's kid, worship leader, like, maybe a bit, he's more extroverted. He's a bit less Swedish, more Puerto Rican and Mexican in that regard. And he was like, no, I don't think that's good. I don't think it's so good to bring that stuff into your mind and your soul and I'm like that. For me, growing up, I was hyper aware of spirituality and hyper aware of what was dark and what was light. And there's probably seasons in my life I liked darker music or more intense music, but I don't think I was ever into but I still drew the line at like, I never was into Kiss. I was never into these like dark shows. I can't really watch horror movies. It messes with my soul, my spirit too much. It messes with my head. Like, I'm too OCD. I start thinking that it's all coming after me,
I just saw a definition of a psychopath as someone who can watch a horror movie and go to sleep and rest well.
That's crazy. I know a bunch of them then. I know a bunch of people. But that does not sit well with me. That stuff does not sit well with me. So we were talking about what's the importance of protecting what you see and what you watch and what you let into your soul and your mind?
It's interesting. When you mentioned Kiss, this is ironic. I don't even know if I ever told you this, but when I was in high school, my little sister, Lay, she actually was a caller on a radio show and won 2 tickets to a Kiss concert. And we were the most irreligious people on the planet.
Yeah.
Right? No church, no God, no nothing. And when she said, I just won 2 tickets to Kiss, and would you take me to the concert? And because she was probably 13 years old.
Yeah.
And I said no.
Yeah.
And she goes, why? I said, because that stuff is like satanic. And I didn't. I
There's
look back.
no,
I may not believe in God, but I don't believe in the devil.
So interesting.
And she got so upset with me. My mom's like, why won't you take her, to this concert? And and I was just, I don't know, something inside of me just drew a line and said, you are not. I'm her high school brother going, you are not going to this concert, and I'm not going to let you go. And so I don't think you have to even be a Christian to have a sense of darkness or evil.
Because I don't think you believed in the darkness. I think the reality is you believed there is darkness out there. So why affiliate yourself or open yourself up to more darkness?
Yeah.
I think that would have been more your logic.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I don't know about God, but I definitely know about this, and this isn't healthy.
Yeah, I don't know if God makes you good, but I know this makes you bad.
Yeah.
Like, I know this destroys you. I know this eats you up alive from the inside out. And yeah, so I do think that's why it's easier sometimes to believe in evil than it is to believe in good. Because it's hard to believe in good because it's hard to find good sometimes. It's easy to believe in evil because it's everywhere.
It's interesting to me because I do think there's like a spiritual attunement, or maybe I'm just hypersensitive. And a name for the brand I'm thinking about, I was thinking about calling it a sensitive kid. And then it could just be like, the abbreviation would just be ASK. I don't know, ASK.
Oh, that's
ASK.
cool.
But I was always very sensitive to this stuff.
You better trademark that pretty fast before the podcast comes out.
I already bought the URLs. I already bought other things. But I do think there's something really interesting about that because for me, I can't watch dark stuff. You can watch dark stuff, ironically. You love, like, the darker the show, the more interested you are in it.
There have been some shows where I just shut it off right away. No, where I just shut it off. I know something very dark is happening.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I don't know. You'll recommend shows and I'm like, how did you sleep after? Like, I can't sleep.
I was
for a
watching
week.
this show. It was an episode.
Yeah.
And in it, evil came in through the TV screen and created like this, what do you call, like a scrambling of the TV.
Yeah.
And the moment that happened in that show, it happened on my TV. And everything started flickering and I just turned it off.
You're like, too close.
Never watching this show ever again.
But I was telling them about you because I was like, man, my dad, like, he doesn't get he gets creeped out, but I think you like the thrill of it, and you're not a dark human by any means. And that was the telling. I was like, I probably have been into darker genres or darker art, but I was very sensitive about it. Whereas like, you're not as sensitive about it, but you've never actually been into it. You're just like, oh, interesting. Like I'm going to watch this, but I don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think if this was like a confessional, no, what I actually like is I love studying the minds of people who see the world that way.
It's interesting.
And so for me, I'm not even watching a show. I'm watching the writers thinking. And
you're trying to get inside the mind of
and that's why maybe I'm a little detached from it because I'm not really in the show's story in that sense. I'm trying to understand, how does this person see reality?
Interesting.
Because some of it is, it's fascinating because there's a lot of people who would say they don't believe in God, who write very nuanced stories about evil, about spirituality, about Satan or demons or spirits or ghosts or whatever it may be. And I always find it really interesting that people who would say there's nothing spiritual, and then they seem to have an uncanny ability to see nuances in a deeply spiritual experience. And I think sometimes that's actually the faster entry point to faith.
Okay, so I sent you this thing, and I can't find it on my phone, but essentially it was Pete Holmes. It was like
I think
a comedian.
Pete Holmes, yeah.
I don't know who it was, but basically he talked about he's like, okay, so I don't understand it. So there's people who believe in God, and there's people who believe in nothing. Mm-hmm. But at the end, do you remember it?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, you talk about it then.
No,
just questions. I can't remember exactly.
People say they can't believe in God, but they believe everything came from nothing. And so the one thing we know doesn't exist is nothing.
Yeah.
But we don't know God doesn't exist, but we know nothing doesn't exist. And he said, and then when you die, if you don't believe in God, you believe it, everything came out of nothing, what happens to you when you die? And they say, well, nothing. So you're literally going back to your creator.
Yeah.
Because if nothing created you, and you're going to nothing when you die, you're actually going back to your creator. So you have the exact same belief system. You're just changing the name for God to nothing.
And that sounded very much like you. Like
when I saw that, I thought, I
think
totally
you
resonated with
said
that.
something
Yes,
almost
I have.
verbatim
Yeah.
like 10, 15 years ago,
Yeah.
and consistently. And I thought it was a really interesting idea because I'm like, man, it's even the times where I'm like, okay, I don't know the language, but I have the understanding. Like I do have the belief, and I do have the like, okay, I know this exists inside of my understanding, or from what I can understand, I do know that this exists and I believe in it. But I do find it really interesting because I think sometimes we can expose ourselves and open ourselves up to things that are very, very dark. Right, and I think we're watching what's going on in the Middle East. We're watching. I think it's the juxtaposition of what you brought up earlier. We have this really interesting case study with WNBA and Caitlin Clark, and something that's really inspirational happening and really fresh that's happening in women's basketball. And then you have war happening, and we live inside of a world that both are happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And so many other really beautiful things are happening, and so many other really heavy things are happening. And we're kind of at this crossroads in culture where if you want to turn off the bad stuff, you can, kind of. If you want to turn off the good stuff, you can, kind of. And you can live within somewhat of the confines of your own reality that you want to create. So how do we stay motivated to create healthy and positive realities? Because I do think when you're in a specific space, and we've talked about this before, like whether you're in a space of listening to music with lyrics or listening to a space, like Mariah always listens to lyrics. I don't listen to lyrics. I just like vibes. I'm such like an LA white girl. I'm like one step away from charging my crystals in the full moon. No, I'm kidding. Like the vibrations and energies. Like I like this. I like the tone of a song. I like the feeling it gives me. I don't really listen to the lyrics, and sometimes later I'm like, oh, I can't play this. This isn't good for my heart or my soul.
Okay, now maybe I'm completely misled on this, but it seemed like just recently, like Taylor Swift in her concerts was basically doing like a Wicca service during her concert.
Couldn't tell you. I don't know.
And then it seemed recently,
don't like her music.
Justin Timberlake did something also that seemed very dark and satanic in his concert.
Didn't hear about that. Don't know anything about it.
And and I put them as like people who I don't put in like darkness. You may or may not like them as artists or whatever, but I don't think of them as like people who would be like the spokespeople of evil or anything like that. And yet that seemed to be something musically or artistically or maybe essentially in the human soul that draws people toward a really dark expression.
Well, can we bring up like even just the whole Biden dubbing Easter Sunday as global transgender
day?
The reality is that Easter changes, that day stays the same, but he didn't wait till next year when it's not on Easter. He did it this year when it is on Easter.
Yeah.
And it feels a little bit, I love dabbling. I love dipping my toes in liberalism just to, feel fresh, feel alive, and then these moments happen and I get really thrown off, or not thrown off. I get really focused. Oh no, you can't tell me trans is healthy. You can't tell me it's biologically backed by any means. Like the science does not back trans. There's no way. We trust the science. We trust the science. We trust the science. You're born with male parts. You die with male parts. You're born with female parts. You die with female parts. The reality is that like that is something we don't get to control, and that's where like the world makes me a little nervous. Not so much that I'm scared of it, but I go, what kind of world are we creating? Are we letting heavy things in, or are we letting dark things in? And and that's like that is where I start, going, okay, there's some obvious underlying dark force that does drive odd like similarities and coincidences or very intentional overt acts of darkness into pop culture and music. And you look at it, it's very fine line. It's either like really positive artists or artists that are very dark. And almost every song is either talking about the demons we're fighting or thanking Jesus for something. Like it's very ingrained in our culture. And I wonder if it's because of where we come from in the States of being, a country born in a God, in God we trust, or if it's the fact that it's just the reality of spiritual warfare around us.
I mean, you've said a lot in just a couple of minutes. And I think that one, I maybe go back and domino some of this is even back to Biden's statement about transgender Awareness Day, whatever it was specifically, as opposed to Easter. I remember being in the White House during the Obama administration, and my sense was that President Obama was very aware it's Easter coming, and Joe Biden was not really as aware, And I have
Joe Biden unaware is surprising to me.
The reason I'm saying that is I imagine for him, he made a proclamation about what was put in front of him. And even though he may not have had that principal agenda to try to make this day more important than Easter, I do think somebody made that decision to try to make this from a presidential level more important than Easter. I don't think that's accidental. I don't think it was accidental that Sigmund Freud opened up his first psychiatry office on Easter Sunday. I think sometimes we need to pay attention to what people are saying rather than trying to reinterpret it to make it more palatable. I also think that there's a self-loathing that becomes a part of the darkness of the human spirit. And we can see it when it comes to religion. Like when we're irreligious, we hate the narrative of self-loathing in Christianity or Islam or whatever religion where, we're just talking about how sinful and wretched and horrible human beings are. But we don't seem to somehow make the association that we're teaching a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old self-loathing when they hate being in a boy's body or they hate being in a girl's body. And I think it's a tragedy that we think that caring for children, caring for people's mental health, and caring for this next generation is reinforcing their self-loathing rather than teaching them to love themselves. And we're not allowed to say this. See, if you have a 10-year-old who's a boy and he hates being in a boy's body, you need to realize somehow your child has learned self-loathing. They hate themselves in how they've been designed and created. And you can change someone's body parts now mechanically through medicine, but you're not going to affect that self-loathing.
No, I wouldn't call that medicine. It's I think it's called. I honestly think it's dehumanization.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Because medicine makes you better.
Yeah,
it should supposedly.
Or science,
right?
But it's mad science.
I think so.
And
feels like almost Frankensteinian.
Yeah, and I have people that I really appreciate, and sometimes I think I mentioned something about my deep concern for the transgender issue in the United States. And someone sent me a DM saying, I'm really disappointed in you and I'm really upset at what you've said. And I actually felt badly because I really do appreciate this person's, loyalty and their following and everything like that.
Who, can you tell me who it was?
Oh, you don't even know them. They're just someone I know who follows for years and years and years.
Okay. Did you publicly say something against trans?
I said something in one of our podcasts about, in one of my messages on a Sunday. I talked about how the attack on our value and identity is reflected in things like children being told that they're in the wrong body.
That's interesting.
And I actually did say that on a Sunday because I just couldn't bear it. And I don't say things to be controversial. And I don't say things, I try so hard to be incredibly inclusive and rounded in my conversations. But this cultural trend of medically changing children's gender is, to me, one of the most horrific things I've seen in my lifetime. And the consequence of that is going to be so brutal in the decades to come. And it just makes me really, really sad. It makes me really sad. And so I'm not saying this because I'm against someone or angry at someone who's gone through a sex change. I'm saying this because this is a parenting problem. This is a cultural problem. This is not a problem with your 10-year-old. This is a problem with us as a society where we're teaching self-loathing to our children. And we're teaching it in multiple levels. We're teaching self-loathing. If you happen to be a white boy in American culture, you're teaching that child to have self-loathing.
Why?
Because you can't be a white boy and not be seen as a person of privilege, of advantage as a racist, as a cultural liability. And what we're teaching our children is to loathe themselves just by virtue of how they were created, whether they're male or female, whether they're white or black or Asian or Latino. And we need to teach our children to love themselves and to embrace how they've been created and seeing that as a gift from God to them. And that's why I think what you said there is really, really important. And then, our overarching conversation is really about evil, strangely enough.
And the things that we let into our worlds. Right? Yeah.
And I do think that when you attack innocence, that is the definition to me of evil. The other day I was telling your mom, I said, sin is when your actions, when you're making a destructive choice against yourself. And to me, evil is when you're making a destructive choice against another. And that's how I define it. It may not be the purest, cleanest definition, but to me, like, what do I call sin? Sin is anything I do that actually destroys the image of God in me. But evil is when I'm making a choice to destroy the image of God in you. And I think that we've become very comfortable with both. And I think it's a dangerous thing. And so, for most of my life, I have had this framework in my mind that the only people, like on a human scale, that I war against are people who try to destroy innocence. And for some reason, you can actually measure how evil something is by how much it despises innocence and wants to consume that. And I do believe in, it's funny, when you watch Star Wars all your life, you understand there's the Force, and there's, a dark and a light to the energy. There are, the Darth Vaders and Luke Skywalkers, and sometimes the legacy blends, right? We find ourselves struggling between light and darkness. When we see it, that's a Hindu narrative, by the way. Star Wars is a Hindu narrative. So when we see the story of good and evil in a Hindu narrative, we seem to accept it. And when we see it in the Christian narrative, we start going, wait a minute, you guys, are being judgmental.
Yeah.
But the reality is that every human story is a story of good against evil. There is not a story. You just decide what you think is good and what you think is evil, and then you tell your story. And right now, the stories have been flipped upside down. And that, to me, is terrifying. And so I don't talk about this a lot because I really am uncomfortable with the way Christians talk about the devil, and I'm uncomfortable with the way sometimes we talk about spirituality and darkness or demons or whatever it may be. But maybe today's podcast is for this, to say, if you've ever respected anything I've ever said, and you believe I have some sense of perspective on life, you need to know that I am absolutely convinced that there is good and evil in the universe.
Yeah.
And that human beings are this unique species where we can choose what power fuels our lives.
Interesting.
This is going to be a controversial podcast.
That's fine. Let them come. I do think we're at a place, though. I don't think, for the most part, the world that fuels our income. Like, I'm not so worried anymore. Because, I think in the past, especially working for church, I feel, there's an indebted nature of, I really respect the organization. I don't want to do anything that would affect the organization in a bad way. Now I do think people in the church, outside the church, around need to talk about these things.
Yeah.
And go, don't go and say everything's the devil or everyone's evil. Just talk specifically about these conversations and open it up and go, okay, I think there's a thoughtfulness here that we need to address, or a lack of thoughtfulness here we need to address, or something that needs to go you can't go unsaid. We need to actually address and bring to light some things. And this isn't new. This is a conversation we've had. But I do think that, there's good and evil everywhere. And Star Wars is really interesting because, you listen to guys who really know the Star Wars world and like the Hindu world as well, because Lucas is a practicing Hindu.
Right.
That for every evil character, there's an equal and opposite positive character. That Darth Vader was not meant to be evil, but he was a response to what was happening on the good side of the Force. And then Luke, his son, is the response to the dark side of the Force. So that there's always this kind of like A and B play, or darkness versus light. And I do think that happens in all of us, right? Like we're so easily, darkness is so easily accessible. Light feels like the journey, but light is so easily accessible. You just have to choose to be a positive human being. I think it's odd that it's easier to stay dark than it is to stay light. But for people who are well practiced in staying positive and staying healthy and receiving goodness, it does feel like there is this, and I even felt it last night in the conversation, because in the past, if I was around people who I know were spiritually maybe in a darker place, when we talk about darker things, I have a harder time pulling myself out from it.
Yeah.
But because it was more like, it was kind of 2 on 2. It was 2 people saying, I'm just like attracted to dark art, but I'm actually like, I love Jesus, I love worship music, I love these things, but I listen to really dark stuff. And I don't even like that playing in my house.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm gonna fill this house with worship before I go to sleep, because now I don't want my mind, I want my mind being realigned to what I know to be healthy.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even say I'm in the best place of my faith right now. I fall back on what I know, and maybe some people might say that's a weakness, but I also think that the foundational part of faith really has become such a strength, right? And what's the worst that could happen? We're wrong, but we were positive. We were wrong, but we were good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, we were wrong, but we fought for love. And we fought for forgiveness, and we fought for compassion.
And I think it's always been the thing that's brought me back to faith and the belief in Jesus, is that even if I'm wrong, I can look back at the end and go, I did it for the right reasons. And Jesus was the good reason.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like there's he's calling me to all good things. So that can't be bad, right? We can do bad things in the name of someone good.
Yeah.
And that becomes murky.
Yeah.
Right.
It's funny when you said that, it struck me. Today I got a DM from someone from Sweden. It was a woman who spoke at a business conference.
This is sponsored by the tourism department of Sweden.
And evidently she was asked to speak on artificial intelligence.
Interesting.
And she sends me this DM, and I see the screen behind her. It's a quote from The Genius of Jesus.
Oh, crazy.
And on it said something about empathy is the highest form of intelligence.
Oh.
And she sends me a note saying, thank you for what you wrote about Jesus. It helped me create a framework for how we should address artificial intelligence in the future.
What was your conclusion?
That what artificial intelligence cannot replace is human empathy.
Wow.
And I mean, it made my morning, thinking this is like such a beautiful thing. But to me, it makes the point that you're making, that Jesus makes the world better regardless of who you think he is, if you just listen to what he said.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you follow his example, the world will get better. By the way,
but you think about that, right? Because we're probably heretical for having this conversation. You're heretical though. I'm just me. But there is something really unique, right? Because if say nothing, that God is the word we used to describe nothing, right? That we come from nothing, because it does say, you have a whole message on the idea that we come from, that God, created us out of nothing, right? Into something.
God created us out of that which is unseen.
With unseen, not nothing.
Yeah.
That we input nothing.
Yeah, we input nothing rather than the unseen.
So he takes the unseen and makes it seen.
Yeah.
Right? So, okay. So So that nothing or that unseen, that's what some people call God, or replace God
Right.
with that word. But if we return to whatever that is, and say maybe we aren't cognizant of our return, either way, our whatever it is that we have lived in this space goes somewhere. And for me, it makes more sense to go, I live by these characteristics that are supposed to align us with the good nothing or the good unseen versus the bad unseen. And if Jesus, all of that Jesus is like an existence and a name that is for like our North Star, like guiding us to the good, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Right? Like the validity of his existence almost is secondary to the fact that the ideals and the reality of what his existence meant really do affect me and affect my life in a really personable way. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah. No, if I didn't believe in God,
Okay.
and all I believed was in energy,
Okay.
and I wanted to live beyond my last breath, if I am the sum total of all my energy, it means everywhere my energy moves the world forward, it is an extension of me. If I use my energy in a destructive world, all that's left of me is the worst of me. If I use my energy to create beauty and wonder and goodness and compassion, all that's left of me is all the good in me. And so there's a sense where even if you don't believe in God, if you want to exist beyond your last breath, then you need to realize that your energy is the momentum of you in the lives of others, and that's the only way you live forever outside of God. And then I, of course, add to that fact that I actually do believe in God.
Yes.
and that I believe that life is one expression of human existence in time and space, and that life exists beyond time and space. And so I gave my life to Jesus so that the only momentum of my life would be the good. There's a sense where you give your life to Jesus and he stops all the negative momentum of your life in eternity and only advances the good.
There is this like interesting imagery that I have at times, because there's that, that scripture that talks about like the valley of the dry bones, which I think is such a crazy like imagery, right? And this idea that wherever we came from is the exhale of a creator or an energy force that propels us into existence, and that death is the inhaling of that same creator life source, returning its oxygen back to itself. There's this really interesting concept. So I'm like, I'm living in between the breath of the universe, like whoever created the universe. That's like an interesting reality.
Yeah.
Right? We die too early sometimes because maybe something inside of all of creation is short of breath, or like, I just think there's this really interesting idea.
Well, it just gives me goosebumps. You think creation is the exhale of God, and when God inhales, he brings all life back to himself.
Back to himself.
It's wow, what a profound insight.
Like, what if we are the blood vessels carrying oxygen inside of the existence of the creator?
If I could just like step backwards a little bit and give like a cultural, maybe just a quick cultural summary when we're talking about our relationship to evil. Before World War II, American sociology had basically eliminated the idea of evil.
Interesting.
And believed in cultural relevance. Cultural relativity, where every culture was equally good. There was no bad culture, there was no good culture. And so American sociology basically said all cultures were equally good. You shouldn't look down on a culture, you shouldn't look up to a culture. We're all the same.
And we're all relative to our societies.
Yeah,
Yes.
But there's no good and evil. And that actually ended up being challenged once Hitler emerged.
Interesting.
Because from a ideological perspective, American intellectualism didn't have a reason to go to war against Hitler. Because if all cultures are equally the same, if they're all good, if they're all equal just relative to each other, then who are we to stop Hitler? Who are we to stop Nazism? Who are we to stop any other cultural expression? And I remember when I first started reading about this when I was younger, I would think to myself, I have about 25% indigenous, blood in my body, and very likely to be Mayan, and
which in your culture, a Salvadorian, they don't really like. It's not something people are proud of.
No,
the brutal nature of the Mayans.
It remains
existed.
Unspoken.
It's like we don't talk about that.
Yeah,
we're native, but we're not Mayan.
Yeah, and I would say, hey, the Mayans, they used to cut your heart out of your chest, and you could see it before you died. As they offered you to the volcano gods or whatever it was, and I would call that an unhealthy culture.
Yeah,
it's like
it's relatively unhealthy.
Yeah. To try to act like all cultures are equally the same is just inane. And so then World War II changed our view of evil. Now we had to actually say that's evil. You can't go to war against something with any sense of rightness or honor or justification if you can't say the other one is evil. And so that you find then it's shifted, and then you find it reversing back around the 1980s, 1990s, where the whole concept of evil became antiquated. Evil is a past idea. It's an evolutionary idea that is no longer has value. And then 9/11 happened. And I remember, I think it was President Bush who actually said this was an act of evil. It's the first time I'd heard that word from the White House in decades. And all of a sudden, all of the American psyche believed in evil because of that act. And then, without even trying to go into all the complexity of what happened afterwards, we justified a lot of things we shouldn't have done because of our view in that sense of that evil. And then there was a frustration because you can't identify where that evil's coming from, and so you just attack something. And I think that's the reality of what's going on in our culture now, is that we try to say that everything's okay and everything's the same and everything's fine. It's all just your opinion. There's no good and evil, except when you see it in such a destructive way you can't ignore it. And which is interesting to me because now the one place where, let's say if you're a liberal intellectual in America, the one place you would say would be evil was if you were anti-environmental. If you were not an environmentalist, if you were not trying to protect the earth, if you were not trying to protect the oceans, the ozone, all the other species on this planet, if you were on the far left, you would see that person as evil. And so what we've done is we've moved evil from a personal responsibility to a global ideology. And so good and evil are big ideas now. They're not personal traits. But the reality is that there cannot be good and evil on a global macro level if there's not good and evil on an individual personal level. And that to me is where this conversation is really important. Do I take personal responsibility for my actions? Do I resist any action that would cause harm to another human being and maliciously? And do I choose the action that makes the world better? And I think that's where it's more nuanced and more difficult when it comes down to me. It's much easier for me to pick a big global issue and go, I'm moral because this is my position, rather than going, I'm moral because I treat people with love and respect. And I don't use people for my personal benefit. And I choose actions that make not only myself better, but the world around me better.
Yeah, there's something so interesting about this. I love that what you brought up. Yeah. The not to be hippie by any means, but I really mean this, but the universe, the world that we live in, the matter and the submatter, the seen and the unseen, really has a way of correcting itself, right? Like And it is interesting as humans, like how we're continuously trying to process how it's correcting itself. And oftentimes we determine whether the way it corrects itself is good or evil. And sometimes is it natural? And you talk about that a lot, because we talk about natural selection, this idea that, there's so much foundational logic in that, but to some degree, like humans are somehow created above what is natural to some degree, right? Like the fact that we have consciousness, the fact that we talk about this idea that we can be both good and evil. You talk a lot about when lions hunt, it's odd that when we see that we don't see the lion as evil.
That's right. There's no good and evil in every other species on this planet.
Right.
Except just us.
Yeah, and maybe that's what this podcast is about, is the lens of good and evil, and how to see and engage and react and interact within like a positive life force.
And maybe to deny evil is to be blind of our power.
Deny evil is to be blind to our power? What do you mean?
Yeah, because we have the power to do good and evil. And when we deny that power, we justify our actions. We should be aware of our power. We can create good, we can do evil. And we're not the same as a tiger or a gazelle or a snake or a shark.
I was talking about this in therapy this last week, and I was talking about, your infamous line of beavers create dams, bees create hives, and humans create futures.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I just wish we could just build a dam. Like I'm someone who is constantly, but I do think that, and I had this thought this last week, that maybe my desire to meet a specific function on this earth is actually my human nature reverting to an animal desire, wanting to be simplified to an animal nature. Right?
Yes.
And I don't know that that's wrong. But it's limiting my existence. I just want to meet this function.
It's so much simpler if you can just be an animal.
Well, now I build dams. I build them. I'm one of the beavers. Yeah. But it is like it. The irony is that desire is for acceptance, right? It's I want to meet a function, so I am accepted by society for bringing a function into society, versus, I don't know, evolving beyond that or growing beyond that nature of going, okay, my maybe is that where being a service to others, being at service to others, is bringing value. This idea of like we talk about this on the business side, bringing value or being at service. How do you do that? A life of service is probably one of the biggest, deepest, purposeful things you can do as a human to society. But is that the difference? Is like meeting a function isn't enough. Bringing purpose and value to the human ecosystem is our design. I
think you're designed to do good. And when you violate that design, it breaks you.
Yeah.
And then you feel something's broken, because once evil becomes easier than good, you know something is terribly broken inside of you. And by the way, that's why we need Jesus. Because when we enter into a relationship with God through Jesus, He redesigns us in our original intention to do good, to be an expression of God's image and likeness. And, so yes, what happens in a relationship with Jesus is you get an intimate relationship with God. But more than that, you get a massive, I don't know if this is the right word, massive redesign. You get re-engineered back to your intention to be a reflection of God's image and likeness.
I'm good here. I feel like this was a satisfying conversation.
I've actually really enjoyed it. This conversation went places I did not expect.
No, we might get in some trouble for this one. It's okay.
Well, let's create some great conversation. You don't have to agree with us.
Yeah, you don't have to agree with us.
Elevate the conversation and tell us why you disagree.
Or just tell your friend. No, but thank you guys for listening to this podcast, and thanks, Dad, for going there and being willing to just explore all of the universe with me, guys. Rate and review this podcast. Subscribe to the YouTube. Also, check out our project at the Arena and thearenasummit.com and join us. Is it April 24th? Is that our next Arena Summit with John Gordon?
I think it is.
Yeah, I believe it's next week, April 24th. It's a free online summit. You can join us. It's going to be me and you with John Gordon online. It's free. It's our whole Arena community and something that we essentially just want to build back into the community that we've built, the tribe that we've built. And this is our way of kind of connecting the Arena conference speakers and having them kind of invest into our community. And it's an amazing space. We usually do like a 30-minute conversation where the speakers we're asking the speaker questions or the speaker's kind of presenting an idea. And then we open up some questions to the whole community, and we end up going for like another hour of Q&As and conversation, and it brings up such interesting things. We had Ali Webb last time, John Gordon this time, we have Dan Bolton next time. We have a really interesting place called the Arena Summit where you can engage in these monthly calls. Go to thearenasummit.com, sign up for this. We'll get you an email and you can log in.
All right, man. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah.
See you next week.
See you next week.
Love you.